The observation deck encounter. Captain Sarah Torres leaned against the reinforced transparisteel window of Station Heimdall's observation deck, watching the parade below with the kind of mild interest one gives to something mildly entertaining but not particularly important. The station's central plaza was filled with delegates, dignitaries, and what looked like half the diplomatic corps of the Valerian Empire, all moving in carefully choreographed formations that probably meant something significant to someone who cared about such things. Sarah didn't particularly care. She was a medical freight hauler, not a diplomat. Her interest in galactic politics extended exactly as far as knowing which systems paid well and which ones had customs officials who enjoyed making life difficult. Still, her navigator Rico had insisted they watch the ceremony, claiming it was a once-in-a-lifetime spectacle, and since they were stuck on station for another 6 hours waiting for cargo clearance anyway, she'd agreed. "This is incredibly boring," May announced from Sarah's left. The engineer was sprawled in one of the observation deck's chairs, her boots propped up on the railing in a way that would probably offend the more formal species on the station. "We've been watching people walk slowly for 40 minutes. This is what passes for entertainment in diplomatic circles." "It's cultural," Rico protested. He was standing on Sarah's right, actually paying attention to the parade with genuine interest. "The Valerians don't do public ceremonies often. When they do, every detail matters. The order of appearance, the colors, the spacing between groups, it all communicates complex political relationships. So they're having an entire conversation through the medium of walking really slowly while wearing fancy clothes," Sarah said. "That's actually kind of impressive in a weird way." "It's tedious in an incredibly obvious way," May countered. "Can we go get food now? I'm pretty sure I've absorbed all the culture I can handle for one day." Sarah was about to agree when something changed in the parade below. The crowd's energy shifted, a ripple of heightened attention moving through the plaza like a wave. She straightened up, her attention suddenly caught by whatever had caused the reaction. A new group was entering the parade route. These were clearly high-ranking Valerians based on the elaborate nature of their formal attire and the size of their escort. The Valerians were a striking species to begin with, tall and elegant with distinctive features that managed to be both alien and oddly beautiful. Most stood around 7 feet tall with elongated proportions that gave them a naturally graceful appearance. Their skin had an almost luminescent quality, ranging from pale silver to deep violet depending on bloodline. Their eyes were larger than human standard, with vertical pupils that could shift color based on emotional state. But what really made them intimidating was their bearing. Every Valerian Sarah had ever encountered moved like they were being constantly evaluated on their posture, which given their obsessively hierarchical society, they probably were. Everything was measured, controlled, perfect. And then she appeared. Sarah's attention locked onto one figure in the procession and she couldn't look away. The woman was clearly Valerian, with the characteristic height and elegant bone structure, but there was something about the way she moved that commanded absolute attention. While the other Valerians walked with formal precision, this one had an additional quality that was hard to define. Confidence, maybe. Presence. The kind of natural authority that made people stop what they were doing and pay attention. Her formal robes were deep crimson with silver embroidery that caught the light with every step. Her posture was absolutely perfect, shoulders back, head high, every movement deliberate and graceful. Even from the observation deck several levels above the plaza, Sarah could see the way the crowd responded to her presence, the way attention followed her progress through the parade route. "Wow," Rico said quietly. "That is one impressive figure." "You mean the woman with the most beautiful ass in the galaxy?" May asked, grinning. "Because yeah, pretty sure everyone watching is thinking the same thing." Sarah felt heat rise to her face. She'd been thinking exactly that, though she hadn't planned to say it out loud. But May wasn't wrong. The combination of the woman's bearing, the way the robes moved as she walked, and her sheer presence created a visual impact that was impossible to ignore. "Do we know who she is?" Sarah asked, trying to sound more professional than she felt. Rico consulted his datapad. "Not specifically identified in the public ceremony roster. Just listed as High Imperial Delegation. Could be any senior noble or court official." "Well, whoever she is, she's definitely the most interesting thing about this entire ceremony," May observed. They watched for a few more minutes as the procession continued, but the mysterious woman had already passed their vantage point. Eventually the parade concluded with formal speeches in the Valerian language that Sarah's translator struggled to render into anything comprehensible. The translation software kept offering options like honored collective flourishing and hierarchical harmony manifestation, which sounded impressive but meant absolutely nothing. "Okay, culture absorbed," May declared. Can we please go find food now? Preferably something that doesn't require walking slowly while wearing uncomfortable clothes. Yes, please, Sarah agreed, though she found her gaze drifting back to the plaza one more time, searching for another glimpse of crimson robes in the dispersing crowd. They found a bar that catered to mixed-species clientele, one of those station establishments that had learned to accommodate the wildly different preferences of dozens of civilizations. Sarah ordered something the bartender claimed was similar to whiskey, May got a local brew that came with enthusiastic recommendations, and Rico stuck with water since he had navigation updates to file later. So, May said once they were settled at a corner table with a good view of the station's main concourse, how long until this story gets retold as Sarah saw the most beautiful woman in the galaxy at a diplomatic parade and fell instantly in love? Sarah nearly choked on her drink. What? No, that's not what happened. We were just making an observation. A completely normal, aesthetic observation. An aesthetic observation about her ass, Rico pointed out helpfully. About her presence, Sarah corrected. Her bearing. The way she commanded attention. It was impressive in a completely professional way. Aha, May said, her grin widening. Keep telling yourself that, Captain. But for the record, when this story gets retold, and it absolutely will because station gossip spreads faster than a hull breach, I'm saying I was there when Sarah Torres fell for a Valerian noblewoman she'll never see again. I did not fall for anyone, Sarah said firmly. I noticed someone who was visually striking at a public event. That's it. End of story. We're going to finish our drinks, check on the cargo clearance, and forget this entire conversation ever happened. Sure, Rico agreed, still grinning. Completely forgettable. We'll definitely never mention it again. But the joke had a life of its own. Over the next few months, whenever Sarah encountered other human freight haulers at various stations and trading posts, someone would inevitably bring up that time at Heimdall Station. The running joke about the most beautiful ass in the galaxy became a kind of shared reference point among independent traders, a bit of harmless humor that connected people who spent most of their time isolated in the black. Sarah mostly found it mildly embarrassing. She'd been the one who first made the observation, or at least the one who'd been present when May said it out loud, which meant she took good-natured ribbing about it whenever the subject came up. But it was harmless. A stupid joke about a woman she'd seen once from a distance and would never encounter again. The Valerians maintained careful distance from most other species. They participated in galactic trade and politics, but always with rigid protocols that made casual interaction nearly impossible. The chances of Sarah ever meeting any high-ranking Valerian, let alone the specific woman from the parade, were essentially zero. So the joke remained just that. A funny story from a layover at Heimdall Station, retold in bars and crew quarters across a dozen systems. Always good for a laugh, usually accompanied by speculation about which specific Valerian official they'd been referring to that day. 3 years passed. Sarah continued running medical freight routes through the outer territories. Rico and May stayed with her, forming the kind of efficient, comfortable crew that made even difficult runs manageable. They built a solid reputation for reliability, which in the freight business was worth more than speed or low prices. Hospitals and research stations knew that if Sarah Torres accepted a contract, the cargo would arrive intact and on schedule. Life was good. Predictable. The kind of steady satisfaction that comes from doing work you're good at and building something reliable. And then Sarah accepted a priority contract for advanced medical equipment delivery to Valera Prime, the capital world of the Valerian Empire, and everything changed. The approach to Valera Prime was impressive in the way that all major imperial capitals tend to be. Carefully managed traffic lanes, extensive orbital infrastructure, defense platforms that were visible but not overtly threatening, and the kind of security presence that reminded visitors they were entering very important territory. Sarah had delivered to Valerian worlds before, but never the capital. Those previous runs had been to colonial outposts or research stations, places where Valerian formality was present but diluted by practical necessity and multi-species interaction. Valera Prime was different. This was the heart of Valerian civilization, where protocol and tradition were maintained with absolute precision. Clearance granted for commercial docking Bay 12, the traffic control officer said in flawless universal standard with the characteristic Valerian accent that made every word sound precisely enunciated. Please follow designated approach vector exactly. Any deviation will result in immediate escort and potential denial of landing privileges. Understood, Control, Sarah replied, keeping her tone equally professional. Following designated vector precisely. They're really serious about procedure here, Rico observed from the navigation station. I've filed flight plans at military installations with less stringent requirements. It's the Valerians, May said from engineering. Everything is procedure and protocol. Most independent operators avoid Capital World contracts because it's too much hassle for standard pay rates. The pay is exceptional on this one though, Sarah noted. Premium rate for medical equipment, priority delivery bonus, and they're covering all docking fees and customs processing. Whatever they need this stuff for, they need it badly enough to make it worth dealing with Valerian formality. The landing was smooth. Sarah had been piloting long enough that complex approach vectors and precise positioning requirements didn't rattle her anymore. They touched down in the designated bay exactly on schedule, which the Valerian Port Authority acknowledged with what might have been approval in their carefully neutral confirmation. Cargo transfer will commence in precisely 30 minutes, the port officer informed them. Please remain with your vessel until transfer crew arrives. Unauthorized movement through port facilities is strictly prohibited. Acknowledged, Sarah said, then closed the comm channel. So we sit here and wait for someone to tell us we're allowed to do our jobs. Welcome to Valerian efficiency, May said dryly. Everything perfectly organized as long as you don't mind waiting for the organization to process you. They waited. Exactly 30 minutes later, Valerian punctuality was apparently not a stereotype but an actual cultural trait. A transfer crew arrived with equipment to offload the medical machinery. The crew was efficient and professional, working with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested extensive training and very clear protocols. Sarah supervised the transfer, checking inventory against her manifest and ensuring everything was handled properly. It was routine work, the kind of thing she'd done hundreds of times on dozens of worlds. She was halfway through verification when she noticed someone approaching from the direction of the port facilities. A figure wearing a hooded cloak that obscured their features but couldn't hide their characteristically Valerian height and bearing. Sarah's attention was mostly on her datapad, tracking the cargo transfer, so she didn't pay much attention until the figure stopped directly in front of her. Captain Torres. She replaced her hood and turned to leave, her guards falling into formation around her. Sarah stood frozen in the docking bay, holding the formal invitation, trying to process what had just happened. Rico and May appeared at her side, both looking stunned. Did that really just happen? May asked quietly. I think so, Sarah said. I think I just got invited to dinner with the Queen of Valeria because I accidentally called her beautiful 3 years ago. You called her ass beautiful, Rico corrected. Let's be accurate about what just happened here. I'm aware, Sarah said faintly. I'm very, very aware. She looked down at the invitation in her hands, still not quite believing this was real. Well, May said after a long moment, this is either going to be the best story we ever tell or the last story we ever tell. I really hope it's the first one. You and me both, Sarah agreed. You and me both. The private audience and new understanding. The Valerian Palace was everything Sarah expected and more. Soaring architecture that somehow managed to blend organic curves with geometric precision, creating structures that seemed to grow from the landscape rather than being built upon it. The materials shifted color based on the angle of the setting sun, moving through shades of silver, violet, and deep crimson. Gardens surrounded the main complex, perfectly maintained yet somehow appearing natural, as if they'd always existed in exactly this configuration. Sarah felt completely out of place despite the formal attire the palace staff had provided. It fit perfectly. The Valerians apparently maintained an extensive wardrobe for visiting dignitaries from various species, but wearing formal clothes didn't change the fact that she was a cargo pilot about to have dinner with a queen. The garment was elegant, tailored to human proportions but incorporating Valerian design elements, deep blue fabric with silver threading that caught the light when she moved. The guards escorting her were professional and silent, leading her through corridors where every surface seemed to be a work of art. Murals depicting Valerian history stretched along the walls, sculptures occupied alcoves, and everything was illuminated by light sources Sarah couldn't quite identify. Every person they passed immediately bowed or stepped aside with practiced deference, which only made Sarah more aware of how unusual this entire situation was. They arrived at a doorway that was smaller and less imposing than she'd anticipated. One of the guards made a complex gesture, some kind of signal, and a moment later the door opened to reveal a chamber that was elegant but surprisingly intimate. More private study than throne room, with comfortable seating, ambient lighting, and large windows overlooking the palace gardens. Queen Isandra was already there, and Sarah felt her breath catch slightly. The queen had changed from the hooded cloak into formal attire that was less elaborate than the parade robe Sarah remembered, but still clearly expensive and beautifully crafted. The fabric was deep violet with silver embroidery that seemed to move in patterns Sarah couldn't quite follow. The crown markings on her face caught the light, creating subtle patterns that shifted as she moved. "Captain Torres," the Queen greeted her, her tone warmer and less formal than their docking bay encounter. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. Please sit. Would you care for refreshment?" The indicated chair was designed for Valerian proportions, which meant Sarah's feet barely touched the floor when she sat. It was mildly embarrassing but unavoidable. A servant appeared with beverages, and Sarah accepted something that turned out to be a spiced tea that was actually quite pleasant, with flavors she couldn't quite identify but found appealing. "Thank you for inviting me, Your Majesty," Sarah said, trying to maintain appropriate formality while her brain continued insisting this entire situation was surreal. "Though I'm still not entirely sure why I'm here, given that I made an incredibly inappropriate comment this afternoon." Queen Isandra smiled, settling into her own chair with that characteristic Valerian grace that made every movement look choreographed. "You are here precisely because of that inappropriate comment. Tell me, Captain Torres, how much do you know about Valerian court culture?" Sarah considered carefully. "I know you value hierarchy and protocol very highly. That your social structures are extremely formal and complex. That you've been a major galactic power for thousands of years and have very specific ideas about proper conduct. That most species find you—" She hesitated, then decided honesty was probably what the Queen wanted— intimidating. "Accurate if incomplete," the Queen said. "What you may not know is how exhausting it is to live within that culture, particularly at the highest levels. Every word I speak is analyzed for political implications. Every gesture is interpreted for hidden meaning. Every interaction is evaluated through layers of protocol and precedent." She took a sip of her own tea, and Sarah noticed she held the cup with the same perfect posture she seemed to bring to everything. "I have been queen for 39 years. In that time, I cannot recall a single conversation that was simply honest communication between two people. Everything is filtered, calculated, measured." "That sounds incredibly lonely," Sarah said before she could think better of it. The Queen's eyes flashed copper, surprise maybe or appreciation. "It is profoundly lonely, Captain Torres. I am surrounded by people constantly. Advisors, guards, servants, courtiers, diplomats. And yet I am fundamentally isolated by the role I occupy." She set down her tea and looked at Sarah directly. "And then a human cargo pilot sees me at a diplomatic parade and comments, crudely but sincerely, on my physical presence. No political calculation, no hidden agenda, just immediate, genuine response." Which was inappropriate, Sarah felt compelled to point out. By Valerian standards, certainly inappropriate. By Valerian standards, absolutely, the Queen agreed. But it was authentic. Unfiltered. Honest in a way that nothing in my daily life ever is. She leaned forward slightly. "I brought you here because I am desperately curious about that kind of unfiltered honesty. I want to have a conversation where you speak to me not as a queen to be deferred to, but as a person. Can you do that?" Sarah thought about it carefully. "I can try, Your Majesty, but it's difficult to forget that you're, the ruler of an empire. That kind of colors how one approaches conversation." "Then let us establish parameters," Queen Isandra said. "For the duration of this evening, there are no political consequences to your words. You may speak freely without fear that I will take offense or that you will face retribution for honesty. I genuinely want to understand how humans, specifically you, view Valerians when unburdened by diplomatic necessity." She paused. "In exchange, I will speak more freely than I normally would. This will be a conversation between two people, not a formal audience between queen and subject." "Agreed." "All right," Sarah said slowly. "If we're really doing this, can I ask something potentially inappropriate?" "That is precisely what I am inviting you to do." "Why me specifically?" Sarah asked. "I assume you have advisors, diplomats, people whose actual job is providing honest counsel. Why bring in a random freight hauler you've never met?" The Queen's expression suggested she'd been waiting for exactly this question. "Because all of those people, advisors, diplomats, counselors, they all have political positions to maintain. They all want something from me even if it's just continued favor. Their honesty is necessarily constrained by their own interests. But you," she continued, "are a cargo pilot. You have no political ambitions in Valerian space. You don't need my favor for your career. You gain nothing from flattering me, which means when you speak honestly, I can trust that it's actually honest, not calculated to achieve some hidden goal." Sarah considered that. "That's actually a reasonable argument. Terrifying that you'd bet on a complete stranger's judgment, but reasonable. I am not betting anything significant, the Queen said. This is a conversation, not a policy decision. I am simply curious about perspectives I normally have no access to. Okay, Sarah said. Then if we're being completely honest, most humans find Valerian culture exhausting. All the protocol and formality feels like navigating a minefield. We tend to avoid extended contact because it's too much work to constantly worry about violating some rule we don't know about. She watched the Queen carefully, trying to gauge whether this honesty was actually welcome or if she was about to get thrown out despite the reassurances. Queen Isandra nodded thoughtfully. Continue. And specifically about you, Sarah said. The reason that joke started wasn't actually crude or it wasn't meant to be. You have a presence that's impossible to ignore. Even in a parade full of dignified people, you stood out. The way you carry yourself, the confidence, it's striking. Humans express aesthetic appreciation differently than Valerians, and what started as genuine admiration got simplified into cruder language because that's how freight crews talk. But the underlying observation was sincere. You're impressive. You're saying the crude joke was actually a compliment, the Queen observed. A badly expressed compliment, Sarah agreed. But yes. The Queen was quiet for a moment, and Sarah couldn't read her expression. Valerian faces were harder for humans to interpret than some species. The larger eyes and different muscle structure made emotional cues subtle and easy to miss. Then Isandra said something Sarah didn't expect. Do you know what Valerians say about me? My own people? No, Your Majesty. They say I am perfectly regal. Appropriately dignified. A suitable embodiment of Valerian values and traditions. They say everything that protocol requires them to say. Her voice carried an edge Sarah hadn't heard before, something like frustration or resignation. No one has commented on my appearance in personal terms in decades, because that would be inappropriate. Overly familiar. A breach of the respect due to the crown. She looked at Sarah directly. You, a human who knows nothing of our protocols, saw me and responded with honest aesthetic appreciation. Crude, yes, but genuine. And I realized I cannot remember the last time anyone reacted to me as a woman rather than as an institution. Sarah felt like she was starting to understand what the Queen actually wanted from this conversation. Not diplomatic advice or political insight. Just connection. Recognition as a person rather than a role. That must be incredibly isolating, she said quietly. It is, Queen Isandra agreed. Which is why I am here having this highly irregular conversation with a cargo pilot I met 6 hours ago. Because you are perhaps the only person in this empire who might actually tell me truth without filtering it through political calculation. They talked for hours after that. The conversation ranged across topics Sarah never expected to discuss with royalty. The Queen asked about her work, about why she chose independent freight hauling over more stable corporate employment, about human cultural approaches to hierarchy and authority. Sarah found herself explaining her career path, her philosophy about independence versus security, her observations about the various species she encountered in her work. She told stories about bizarre delivery requests and the strange cargo she'd hauled over the years, the time she transported a shipment of live crystalline organisms that sang in harmonics that drove her crew slightly crazy, the delivery to a research station where the scientists were so focused on their work they forgot to actually unload the supplies for 3 days. In return, Queen Isandra shared carefully edited glimpses of her own life. The pressures of hereditary rule, the weight of decisions that affected billions of lives, the isolation of being the ultimate authority with no peers to confide in. She talked about Valerian culture with a mixture of pride and frustration, loving the depth and richness of her civilization's traditions while chafing against their rigidity. You know, Sarah said at one point, emboldened by several hours of surprisingly natural conversation, you're much more approachable than your reputation suggests. The Queen's expression turned melancholy. That is because you are seeing the person beneath the crown. Most beings only ever interact with the role, never the individual who inhabits it. Do you have friends? Sarah asked, then immediately worried she'd overstepped. I mean, people you can just talk to without all the political weight? I have advisors who I trust professionally, Queen Isandra said. I have courtiers who attend me. I have guards who would die to protect me. But friends? People I can simply be myself with? She paused. No, Captain Torres. I do not have friends. Queens do not have that luxury. The sadness in her voice was genuine and profound. Sarah felt something shift in her understanding, not just of the Queen's situation, but of why she'd really invited her here. You didn't bring me here for advice or perspective, Sarah realized. You brought me here because you're lonely and you needed someone to talk to who would treat you like a person. Queen Isandra was silent for a long moment. Then, yes, that is precisely why you are here. I apologize if that is disappointing. It's not disappointing, Sarah interrupted gently. It's honest. And honestly, I'm probably not qualified to advise on running an empire anyway, but I can definitely have a conversation with someone who needs one. Something in the Queen's expression softened. Gratitude maybe, or relief. Thank you, Captain Torres. That is more valuable than you might realize. They continued talking until late in the evening. Sarah shared more stories about life as an independent trader, the freedom and uncertainty that came with it, the satisfaction of building something on your own terms. The Queen talked about diplomatic challenges, the delicate balance of maintaining relationships with dozens of species while preserving Valerian cultural identity. They debated human versus Valerian approaches to conflict resolution, discovered shared appreciation for mathematical patterns in nature, and argued cheerfully about whether human or Valerian music was more emotionally resonant. At one point Sarah made a joke about Valerian formal robes looking spectacularly uncomfortable, and the Queen actually laughed, genuine and unguarded, and admitted the ceremonial attire was essentially dignified torture. The parade robes weigh nearly 15 kilograms, Isandra confided, and the collar requires you to hold your head at precisely the correct angle or it cuts into your neck. I have scars from coronation ceremonies. That's insane, Sarah said. Why not redesign them? Because they have been worn by Valerian monarchs for 8,000 years, the Queen replied. Tradition is not easily set aside, even when it causes literal physical pain. I have a proposal for you, Captain Torres, Queen Isandra said as the evening wound toward its close. I wish to continue these conversations. I need someone who can speak to me without the burden of Valerian protocol, who can offer perspective from outside our cultural assumptions. Would you be willing to return to Valera Prime periodically for such discussions? Sarah felt the weight of what she was asking. Your Majesty, I'm just a freight pilot. I have no qualifications for advising anyone on anything important. Your qualification is precisely that you are not a qualified advisor, the Queen interrupted. You have no political agenda. You gain nothing from flattering me or calculating your words. That makes you perhaps uniquely positioned to provide the honest perspective I need. She paused. I would compensate you appropriately for your time, of course. And this would remain private, not a formal diplomatic arrangement. Simply conversations between two people who have discovered they value each other's company. Sarah thought about Rico and May's reactions when she explained this. About how strange her life had become in the span of a single day. About the profound loneliness she'd seen in the Queen's eyes when she talked about having no one to simply be herself with. All right, she said. I accept. Though I maintain that I'm completely unqualified and you're taking a huge risk trusting the judgment of someone you just met. Perhaps, Queen Isandra agreed. But you are honest, Captain Torres. In my position, that is qualification enough. She stood, signaling the evening was ending. Thank you for accepting my invitation. For speaking honestly. For treating me as a person rather than an institution. That is a gift I did not know I needed so desperately until I received it. Sarah stood as well, automatically offering a respectful bow that felt appropriate despite their agreement to speak freely. Thank you for trusting me with this, Your Majesty. I hope I can actually be helpful. You already have been, the Queen said simply. The guards appeared to escort Sarah back through the palace. As they walked through the elegant corridors, Sarah's mind was racing. She'd accepted a contract to deliver medical equipment and somehow ended up becoming a confidant to an alien queen. It was absurd. Completely outside anything she'd ever imagined her life would include. And yet, thinking about the genuine relief in Isandra's expression when Sarah had agreed to return, thinking about the loneliness that came with ultimate authority, it felt right somehow. Important in a way that had nothing to do with politics or diplomacy. Back at the docking bay, Rico and May were waiting anxiously. They practically pounced on her the moment she emerged from the transport. Well? May demanded. Are you alive? Not arrested? What happened? I had dinner with the Queen of Valeria, Sarah said, still processing it herself. We talked for hours. About her job, my job, Valerian culture, human perspectives. Everything. And? Rico prompted. And she wants me to come back regularly. To keep having conversations. Because apparently I'm one of the only people who treats her like a person instead of a political institution. May stared at her. You're telling me that the crude joke about the beautiful alien woman has resulted in you becoming the Queen's personal confidant? I think so, Sarah said. I'm still not entirely sure this is real. This is the weirdest thing that has ever happened to any of us, Rico observed. And we once delivered cargo to a station that existed in a controlled time dilation field. I know, Sarah agreed. But she's lonely. Genuinely, profoundly lonely. And for some reason she thinks I can help with that. Can you? May asked. Sarah thought about the evening, about the moments when the Queen's carefully controlled expression had softened into something genuine, about the laughter they'd shared over the absurdity of formal court protocols. Maybe, she said. I can at least listen. Apparently that's more valuable than I realized. They prepared for departure the next morning, the medical equipment successfully delivered and all documentation processed with Valerian efficiency. Sarah found a message waiting for her from the palace, details about the next suggested meeting time and a formal contract for consulting services that included compensation so generous it made her slightly uncomfortable. As they lifted off from Valera Prime, Sarah looked back at the elegant architecture of the capital city growing smaller below them. So, Rico said from the navigation station, we're really doing this? Regular trips to the Valerian capital so you can have dinner with the Queen? Apparently so, Sarah confirmed. This is going to be one hell of a story, May observed. The freight hauler and the lonely Queen. It's not a story, Sarah said. It's just two people who found an unexpected connection. Nothing more complicated than that. But as they jumped to hyperspace, heading back toward more familiar territories, Sarah found herself already thinking about the next conversation, about what they might discuss, about the strange and unexpected friendship that had emerged from one spontaneous observation 3 years ago. She'd called a woman beautiful at a parade, never knowing that woman was a queen. And somehow, impossibly, that crude joke had become something genuine. A connection that bridged different species, different cultures, different worlds entirely. Life, Sarah reflected, was stranger and more wonderful than any cargo manifest could ever predict. And she was curious to see where this particular journey would lead.